Got it.
All right, here we go. Let's have fun.
Good evening, everybody. As folks are entering the attendee room, we'll give it a couple minutes here. It takes a little while for everybody to get into the room, so just bear with us for a couple minutes, please. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Appreciate you taking the time to be here with us this evening on I think it's a beautiful day all across Pennsylvania. I'm Nick Pinizzato. I'm with the National Deer Association, and I actually am a Pennsylvanian as well. And I know on my side of the state, the opposite side of the state, it's been a beautiful day. So hopefully you're experiencing the same thing. But we appreciate you being here to talk about chronic wasting disease, which is not the most fun and exciting topic, but it's an important one. And that's why we're going all around the state and holding these meetings to tell you a little bit about the disease and also to answer your questions. And we've got a really good lineup for you this evening. We're going to take you from the very local all the way through the national perspective. And so I'll just go around and introduce the folks that you see here that are going to present to you this evening. First, you're actually going to hear from your region, which is great. Dustin Stone is here. He's the Information and Education Supervisor for your region. So he's going to lead us off. We also have John Morgan, the Wildlife Management Supervisor for the Southeast region with us as well. We appreciate you guys being here. Then we're going to jump right into the national perspective. What's going on around the country? Because CWD certainly isn't something that's just unique to Pennsylvania. And Brian Richards is with us from USGS. He is a wildlife biologist. His title is Emerging Disease Coordinator, and Brian works on this issue all across the country. After that, you're going to hear from Kip Adams, another Pennsylvania native, who is going to tell us some really cool things about Pennsylvania and why CWD matters here. And then Andrea Corman, the CWD biologist from the Pennsylvania Game Commission, is going to tell us what the Game Commission is doing on this disease, and it's quite a bit. So look forward to hearing from her. We also have with us here Scott Weber and Eric Gagne. They are from the Pennsylvania Wildlife Futures Program, which is a partnership between the Pennsylvania Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania, and more specifically, the veterinary school, Penn Vet. So they'll be here to help answer some questions as well. If you don't know a lot about the Wildlife Futures Program, I encourage you to look that up. There's a lot of really cool things going on. One final thing I'll say before we go ahead and jump into the program here is that, and somebody's already taken us up on this, we've got a question and answer box at the bottom. If you scroll to the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see things like participants and chat window, Q&A. Put your questions in the Q&A. And at the end of this, we will go through your questions and get them to the appropriate person to answer. The chat feature is just if you want to chat amongst yourselves or put something out there for everyone to see, you can use that. But we do appreciate the questions going into the Q&A section. So with that, I think you've heard enough for me at this point. We're going to go ahead and turn it over and hear from the folks in your Southeast region. And Dustin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Nick. As Nick mentioned, my name is Dustin Stoner. I'm the Information Education Supervisor for the Game Commission Southeast region. And as important for this conversation, I'm also a Pennsylvania deer hunter and have been for 38 years. So this, the chronic wasting disease is not only important to me professionally, but it is personally. So with that, I will start sharing my screen and start with my program. Chronic wasting disease, a serious threat to Pennsylvania's deer and elk herd. Chronic wasting disease, we're going to start with a real quick, brief overview on CWD. CWD is a brain disease that affects members of the deer family. It is an always fatal disease, is believed to be caused by a misshapen protein we refer to as a prion. This prion travels through the nervous system, causing healthy brain tissue to die off and holes in the brain, which causes the wasting of the animal. As I mentioned, it's always fatal, and there is no vaccine to prevent the disease in the members of the deer family and cervids, and there is no treatment at this time to treat animals that are infected with CWD. And looks can be deceiving. CWD has a long incubation period. Symptoms don't often occur in the animal for 18 to 24 months. So if you look at the image to the left of your screen, the healthy looking buck, just looking at him, he looks perfectly healthy. However, that deer could have chronic wasting disease. It could be shedding those prions throughout its environment or in contact with other deer, spread to other deer. Conversely, you have the deer to the right that is obviously looking sick and ill, but that's not a sure sign that the animal has CWD. There can be a host of diseases and parasites that could cause that animal to have such a low body score. So looks are deceiving. Just because an animal looks healthy doesn't mean it doesn't, couldn't potentially have chronic wasting disease. How is CWD spread through the deer herd? Through direct and indirect means. So directly, deer can spread it from deer to deer through direct contact. Also indirectly, CWD prions are shed in saliva, urine, and feces. So as the animal moves through its environment, it can shed these prions, which can be infecting other deer. If you look at the image in the bottom with all the deer feeding at the corn pile there, those deer could be spreading CWD amongst the herd. How does the Game Commission monitor for CWD? We monitor and test hunter harvested deer. We do this through our head bins, where hunters voluntarily place the heads from their animals in the bins, and agency staff will go around and collect those heads and pull samples and send them in for testing. We also have extraction stations, and the extraction stations are where our deer aging teams collect heads from deer processors and take them back. These are random samples. They take them back to the stations, remove the samples, and submit them for testing. We also test roadkill deer. We have contracted with individuals to pick up roadkill. Also, our staff pick up roadkill deer, and this occurs in our disease management areas. We want to test deer. We can get deer samples from areas where we have low hunter harvest, and we can get samples throughout the year. And we also test suspects or other deer. And these deer could be possibly sick deer or escapees from captive facilities, which we also want to test. Our Southeast region is indicated here on the map. It includes Berks, Bucks, Chester, Dauphin, Delaware, Lancaster, Lebanon, Lehigh, Montgomery, Northampton, Philadelphia, and Schuylkill County. The 12 counties inside that blue highlighted area. You can also see the DMA4 indicated in the green shaded area. CWD was first detected in the Southeast region in northern Lancaster County in 2018. The detection occurred on a captive facility. And in 2020, in 2018, the DMA4 was created. And in 2020, it was expanded for a second detection that occurred in central Lancaster County. Currently, DMA4 covers approximately 750 square miles and includes portions of Lebanon, Berks, and Lancaster County. And again, the CWD detections were in captive deer. We have not had any wild deer test positive for chronic wasting disease yet. Our sampling efforts from the 2021 fiscal year, 2021 fiscal year, include 886 deer sampled and tested. 711 of those deer were hunter harvested deer. 150 were roadkill deer, and 25 were in that other classification, either sick deer or escaped positives. Escaped captive deer, and no wild positives have been detected. To drill down a little bit on our extraction stations, our deer aging teams, again, collect heads from deer processors and randomly throughout the region. This occurs in the firearms deer season. We sample the entire region. And we have 711 samples from this last fiscal year. 147 of those samples were from the DMA4 counties of Berks, Lancaster, and Lebanon. The image there is of our deer head bins, and we place these throughout our disease management area 4. We place them conveniently so hunters will voluntarily deposit their heads in there after harvesting a deer. During this last fiscal year, we had 264 samples voluntarily deposited in those bins. We have our biologists and staff go around and collect the bins daily or every other day and pull those samples and submit them for testing. Our breakdown for the region, we had 108 deer submitted from Berks County, 40 from Lebanon, and 112 from Lancaster County. We also had an additional 4 deer that the hunters from Dauphin County, successful hunters from Dauphin County, had deposited in the head bin for testing. As I mentioned, we collect roadkill deer within our DMA4 area. Last fiscal year, we tested 150 roadkill deer, and which was important for the lower expanded portion of DMA4 because we don't have quite the hunting pressure down there. So it allows us to collect samples of wild deer so we can submit them for testing. We also have in our DMA4 a DMAP, a Deer Management Assistant Program established, and that's DMAP 3468. During the last hunting season, we issued 3,307 DMAP permits for hunters to go out and harvest antlerless deer in that purple highlighted area at the top portion of DMA4. Of those 3,307 permits, 2,313 reports were provided to the agency. Of those 2,313 hunters that reported, 482 reported harvesting a deer, and 1,831 reported no harvest. And 994 failed to harvest or failed to report their harvest, whether they did or they didn't harvest. So that's kind of a wrap up on our Southeast region. As I mentioned, we have not had any wild positive detections, and it's only been in those 2 captive facilities where we've had positive CWD detections. Okay, I will close my program out here and send it back to Nick.
All right, Dustin, thank you very much. Appreciate that. And several people have joined the show here while Dustin was presenting. And so you missed the part where I said, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen. We've already gotten a couple good ones, so we'll get to those at the end of the program. And so with that, you've gotten your regional perspective. And John, did you have anything additional you were going to share?
No, I think Dustin hit the highlights. The only thing I would mention is those numbers that we've been testing have been pretty consistent over the last 2-3 years. So he was giving you numbers from this past fiscal year, but we've been testing about 500 a year. And like he emphasized, and that's the big point, no wild deer in Southeast Pennsylvania yet that have been tested positive.
All right, let's keep it that way. Very good. All right, now we're going to go ahead and get a national perspective, and there's nobody better to give this presentation than our friend Brian Richards from USGS. So Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Nick. You should see my screen up there now.
I do. It's a beautiful picture.
All right, thank you. Well, let's go ahead and put some slides up instead. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. And thanks, Nick. Yep, my name is Brian Richards. I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey at our National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin. Our science center, which is pictured here, conducts diagnostics, wildlife disease research, and provides epidemiological and technical assistance to states, tribes, and federal partners. We're the only federal facility with a focus on wildlife health that's solely for the benefit of wildlife. We are recognized by the World Organization for Animal Health as a collaborating center for wildlife diagnostics and biodiversity, and by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations as a reference center for wildlife disease diagnostics. We've been around, National Wildlife Health Center has been around since 1975, been involved with a number of high-profile wildlife disease issues since that point in time. But we started out early on with things like lead poisoning, West Nile virus, white nose syndrome, more recently, highly pathogenic avian influenza, and now things like rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus and SARS coronavirus 2 in wildlife. Been involved with chronic wasting disease since 2002, literally the day after it was announced it was detected in the state of Wisconsin. I've been at the center myself since 2004 and with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for a little over a decade prior to that. So this evening, I'll be giving you a real short primer and update on CWD in North America. But before I do get started, I'd like to thank the sponsors, the National Deer Association, Pennsylvania Game Commission, and the Penn Wildlife Futures Program for sponsoring this event. And again, to reiterate, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking the time and effort to attend tonight. So I'm going to begin with a news piece that was published in Penn Live, I guess close to a month ago now, by Marcus Schneck. And so the author goes out, identifies deer killed by hunters in the 2021 hunting seasons in Pennsylvania's hot zone for CWD, found to be infected with the disease at a rate of 14%, up from 8% the previous year. And that included testing more than 12,000 whitetails last year for chronic wasting disease. Out of those 12,000 plus, total of 218 of those deer had CWD, number that Matthew Schnupp, director of the Commission's Bureau of Wildlife Management, describes as a literal punch in the stomach for wildlife managers and hunters. Commissioner Timothy Layton stated that the only hope for making things better in the established area and for keeping CWD at bay elsewhere in the state is for hunters to help wildlife managers. And the author concludes identifying that hunter resistance to deer reduction efforts can be a stumbling block to efforts to battle the disease. So to summarize from that article and from other data sources, CWD seems to have a pretty good foothold in Pennsylvania, and it's likely not getting better. It's likely getting worse. Management efforts don't seem to be working very well to stop the disease. And identify that hunters, if they don't support and actively engage in management, things like that, it's not likely to change. CWD is likely to continue to grow and continue to spread to other parts of the state. So this is a reality that's been experienced over and over in other states and provinces. And so it's fairly simple to predict right now the road you're headed down may lead to more of those punches in the stomach. We'll start with a few high-level observations about CWD. What's it doing out there? First, it's spreading geographically, both nationally and in Pennsylvania. Prevalence, or the proportion of the population affected with CWD, is growing in many locations, including in Pennsylvania. CWD kills some deer directly, but what may be more important is that CWD results in progressive neurological degeneration, thus predisposing deer to other sources of mortality, like getting hit by a car, an arrow, or a bullet. Whatever the ultimate cause, deer with CWD tend to die much sooner than they would have otherwise. Some of the consequences of CWD. First, it's very expensive. Every facet of CWD costs real dollars to natural resource agencies, including the Game Commission. On top of that, CWD has tended to erode stakeholder trust in their management agencies. In the longer term, there can be other pretty substantial impacts as well. Deer populations tend to suffer over the long term. Initially, you might start beginning to see a decline in harvestable surplus, or that segment of the population you hunt every year. And in a few areas with very high prevalence, CWD has actually driven population decline. Demographic shifts in the herds are also likely to occur, moving to younger age classes. So if your goal is to produce or harvest older aged animals, those often managed for and desired by hunters, you're likely not to be able to sustain that goal. Hunter behavior is also predicted to change. If you live and hunt in an area with high prevalence, maybe in that 30 to 40 to 50% range, either you or a family member might change your hunting behavior, either choosing to hunt elsewhere or stop deer hunting altogether. And if that happens, it circles back to the ability of the Game Commission to manage not only deer, but all the other resources that rely on hunting license dollars. So here again is a picture of a deer, maybe has CWD, Maybe not. I can't tell you whether this deer has CWD, and nobody else can merely by looking at it. CWD positive deer looked and act perfectly normal for many, many months before they start to develop that classic wasting appearance. But if this deer has CWD, she's actively shedding infectious agent into the environment, and she's capable of infecting other deer. She looks just fine though. And this is one of the issues that natural resource managers have to deal with. Most hunters, even in hard hit areas, have never seen a deer in the clinical phase of CWD. So it's hard to fathom that the silent killer is really out there, but it is. This slide lists some of the characteristics of CWD. It is a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy in the same category of diseases which include Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in humans and bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. The hallmarks of all TSCs include very long incubation periods, progressive neurological degeneration, a relatively brief clinical phase, followed by death. CWD and its cousins scrapie and sheep are unique among TSCs in that diseased animals shed infectious agent via bodily fluids like saliva, urine, and feces, and can directly infect other herd or flock members. Deer become infected by ingesting or inhaling that infectious agent. Transmission can be, again, by direct contact or indirect with a contaminated environmental fomite. Vertical or doe to fawn transmission prior to birth has been documented and plays an unknown role in nature. The incubation period is protracted, followed by a brief clinical phase. Infected animals shed infectious agent long before the onset of clinical disease, and those shed prions can persist in the environment for years, likely decades, and serve as a reservoir of infectivity for other animals. We tend to see higher infection rates in males and in older age classes of each sex. So we can test for the disease in live deer, but it's very challenging. So the majority of surveillance samples are collected from hunter-killed animals. At this time, our management tools are pretty limited, and there's little evidence of widespread genetic resistance. So the combination of these characteristics makes CWD very, very challenging to manage in free-ranging populations. So what does CWD do to an individual deer? Well, as we've identified, CWD literally is a death sentence for every deer that gets it. If disease runs its full course, it's likely a couple years on average. But due to progressive neurological degeneration during the course of disease, most CWD positive deer die of some other factor, and they die even sooner. Well, that's the very basics of what CWD is and what it does to deer. But why should we care? After all, there's a lot of deer out there, right? So in 2016, Drs. Mike Miller and John Fisher presented a paper at the North American Natural Resources Conference, wherein they described the first 50 years of our experience with CWD. And in it, they posed two overarching reasons why we might be concerned about CWD. First, CWD in the long run tends to be very hard on deer populations. The second is that we cannot rule out that CWD could someday become a human health issue. That remains an open question, but not consuming venison from CWD positive deer is what human health experts recommend. Now I'm going to take a few moments and go through some data, science regarding what CWD might be doing at the population level to cervids, or members of the deer family. So here is the current documented distribution of CWD in North America. It's been detected in 26 states and 3 Canadian provinces in free-ranging and or commercial captive facilities. On the captive side, CWD has been documented in approximately 150 facilities in the United States and 128 in Canada. On this map, the polygons represent CWD in wild deer, elk, and moose, and the dots represent captive deer operations where CWD has been detected. CWD has also been documented in South Korea, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. So pretty clear, CWD has a substantial geographic footprint here in North America, both in wild and in captive deer. Well, let's take a second and go back in time to 2005. This was only a few years, 3 years after CWD was first detected in Wisconsin, and right after it was detected in both New York and West Virginia. Things look quite a bit different on that map than they do today. Now here's 2013, right after Pennsylvania had announced their initial detections in wild deer. A single captive deer farm had been detected in Pennsylvania as well at that time. And here we are back at the current time. Pennsylvania and the rest of North America look quite different than it did a mere 8 years ago. Now I'm going to hone a little bit on your region. This is right after your initial detection in 2012. CWD had also been detected in West Virginia, Maryland, and a single county in Virginia. Plus you have that initial captive facility over there in Adams County. Now back to the current time. CWD picked up in wild deer in 14 counties in Pennsylvania and more to the south as well. It's also been confirmed now in 28 captive deer facilities in the state of Pennsylvania. That's really important for me to note that this map includes an entire county, even if there's only a single wild positive in that county. That's the level of data I have access to, and at the national level for mapping, it works just fine. But it does, when I zoom into a smaller area, it tends to exaggerate where CWD has been confirmed. But that being said, the way CWD tends to spread geographically may not be an exaggeration for all that long. Here's a case in point. Virginia, just a week ago, announced a detection in Montgomery County in a 2.5-year-old buck taken by a hunter last November. This was 160 miles from their closest existing case. And Ohio documented their first wild positives in the state in Wyandotte County in 2 deer taken this past season. So that map changes pretty regularly. Now I'm going to show you some data from my home state of Wisconsin. The red squares represent 1-mile sections where CWD has been confirmed in 1 or more hunter-killed deer. CWD first confirmed again in Wisconsin in 2002, and they conducted a massive amount of surveillance in the next few years. Over 40,000 samples were processed in 2002 alone, and those were primarily from hunter-killed deer. So this really is a pretty good approximation of where CWD was in 2005. Now up to the current time. CWD was picked up in 1,578 deer in Wisconsin last year, out of just under 19,000 samples. So in perspective, you had 218 positives out of about 12,000 samples. So Wisconsin's a little ahead of you. It's now been picked up in 32 of 72 counties in Wisconsin in wild deer, and it's in now over something over 8,000 individual positive hunter-killed wild deer. Sampling in the state is voluntary, so what's been detected, or that 8,000 number, is a subset of the actual number killed by hunters and what exists today in the wild. Plus, we have 29 captive facilities where CWD has been detected. So I'd argue, based on what we've looked at, just the mapping data, that there's been a pretty dramatic expansion in CWD's footprint nationally, in my home state of Wisconsin, also in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. But what about prevalence, or the proportion of a herd impacted by disease? Is disease increasing as well as spreading? So again, here's more data from Wisconsin. The 3 dots are areas where CWD is performing quite well. So I'm going to zoom in now on one of the prevalence charts so we see it. The curves represent the proportion of deer that tested positive and how that increased over time. You can see in this zone, CWD was essentially non-existent back in 2002 and for the next several years. Then it really took off. Today, if you shoot a mature buck in this zone, it's literally 50-50 odds that that deer has CWD. 1 in 3 odds in adult does and yearling bucks, and 1 in 5 in yearling does. So prevalence has risen exponentially over the course of the last, since we picked up CWD in the state. So here's an image from the Game Commission website showing CWD testing results. This is for all samples collected last year, so the reported percent positive is pretty small, less than 2%. But look at the rate of growth in the bar chart on the lower right. The rate of detecting positives is increasing pretty rapidly. So this time, same site, I selected adult males and hunter-killed deer. I'm not sure what the geographic extent is, but I believe it's likely just the CWD DMUs. Now you're up to almost 5% prevalence. And we'd expect that, as adult males are more likely to be CWD positive than other herd segments. But look at that growth trend in the lower right. I've sketched an exponential growth curve over the top of that chart, and the fit is visually pretty good. So unfortunately, I'd have to argue that CWD appears to be performing in your core area in a fashion very similar to that in Wisconsin, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the list would go on. And after all, why wouldn't it? What is Pennsylvania doing today? And what are you willing to do tomorrow to alter that trend and outcome? Earlier, I mentioned that one of the potential long-term outcomes is hunters changing their behavior in CWD areas. So a really good friend of mine is very active in the CWD world and in social media. And a few months ago, he started soliciting what he referred to as CWD stories from some of his contributors. And here's one from the very core of the CWD area in Wisconsin. So I'll paraphrase. In 2014, a group of hunting buddies leased 280 acres in the absolute core of the heart of CWD in Wisconsin. They had that lease for 4 seasons, and in that time frame, every single buck they killed was CWD positive. Over 4 years, more than a dozen CWD positive deer. It became so bad that they gave up the lease and checked out. Couldn't stand shooting the deer and not being able to eat them. So that's pretty impactful to me, the idea that every single deer they shot, every buck they shot over the course of 4 years had CWD. It's pretty sobering. And I'll be honest, I can't imagine wanting to hunt there myself. So what can be done about CWD? And what's the Commonwealth willing to do about it? Remember that statement, after all, coming from Commissioner Layton about needing hunter support. Now, I have to insert a caveat here whenever I discuss management options. Pennsylvania is not my home state. I have no management prerogative or authority in your state or anywhere else for that matter. I cannot tell you what to do. That's your choice. Absolutely your choice, not mine. But there are some opportunities. So I kind of look at management of CWD as a two-part story. First, if you don't have it, you might want to consider doing everything you can to keep it that way. You do have some control here. First, identify all the possible ways that CWD could come to you, and I'll identify people who are involved in most of them. Then implement regulatory measures that can slow or stop those processes. But regulations, as we found, on their own are likely not enough. Providing information and education to stakeholders is necessary, as a well-informed populace is more likely to make better choices and reduce risk. Another caveat, though, if you're really close geographically to where CWD already is in the wild, those precautionary measures will be less effective. You might be able to get humans to stop moving CWD, but deer will continue to move it themselves, and that's much harder to address. Part 2, if you have CWD, do something about it, but do it in a measurable and meaningful way that can actually alter outcomes. So here's an example. Pennsylvania, many other jurisdictions are doing a tremendous amount of disease surveillance right now, and that's really important. Learning about how CWD is performing out in the real world is a very good idea, but surveillance itself is not active disease management. Surveillance is watching, but it does not alter disease outcomes. So early on, I mentioned that the CWD toolbox doesn't seem to have a lot in it right now. Well, what would that really good-looking full toolbox look like? For CWD, here's some of the things I think would be really useful. Maybe we'll have them someday, but we don't today. And it'll likely be a long time before we have many of these. There's ongoing research into vaccines. Again, we're likely years away. But think about it. Even if we have a vaccine, we have a pretty significant logistical hurdle delivering it to millions of deer across such a large swath of North America. There's ongoing research into genetic resistance in captive deer, but to date, there's no genotype that is completely resistant to CWD. They all seem to get the disease. Some just live longer than others with the disease. And once again, how do we produce enough of these genetic marvels to alter genetic composition at the population level in the wild? Disinfectants, both for use with tools, surfaces, vehicles, and to mitigate the environmental contamination in the wild. That would be a really important capability. Now, if we could somehow identify whether a deer has CWD remotely, then selectively remove only positives, we could really start to alter outcomes, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. And better tests, especially ones where we can determine whether CWD is or is not in an area without ever testing a deer. Science is really making progress on that one. But again, just knowing where disease is does not alter outcomes. It's still watching, but with better tools. So we don't have any of these tools today, but I would still argue it makes a lot of sense to do what we can to address CWD now, and then it would be simpler to use these tools if and when they're developed and available. So what do we have for tools today? Essentially, we have the same ones we've had for a very long time. And that includes lethal removal of animals from affected populations. And that's both inside fences and in the wild. There's clearly different ways to use this tool depending on your situation and goals. I'm not going to go into great detail, but this tool is one that absolutely does hold promise if wielded in an aggressive, sustained, and targeted manner. The last 2 points are very important as well. Are there any impediments to removing deer in Pennsylvania today? Are there seasons, bag limits, restrictions on any group or cohort of deer that prevent willing hunters and landowners from taking this task on? And are there mechanisms that the Commonwealth could adopt that might compel reluctant stakeholders to participate? Experience suggests that you're going to have to think well outside the box to be successful with this disease. Good news is you don't have to start from scratch. So here's 2 resources I highly recommend. AFWA, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, recently published a set of best management practices. And the Western states and provinces, who've been dealing with CWD longer than anyone, published a set of adaptive management guidelines a few years back. These are available freely online, and I'd encourage anyone interested in CWD to take a look at them. So here's the best management practices for actively dealing with CWD in the wild. They make sense and represent what science and experience offer. First, targeting deer most likely to have CWD. And remember, that begins with the adult males. Targeting animals in CWD hotspots, kind of like stamping out a campfire before the sparks shoot out and light the forest on fire. Adjust season timing. Do you have open hunting during the peak of the rut in Pennsylvania? Do you allow the most efficient weapons to be used during the rut? Are there limits on the number and the kind of deer that hunters can take? Reducing density in CWD zones. The lower the population, the fewer the positives you have remaining. Lowering density likely will not reduce prevalence in and of itself, at least in the short run, but it will reduce the standing crop of positives on the landscape. And from a disease perspective, that's a very good thing. Eliminating any practices that congregate deer. Baiting, feeding, lures, both natural and artificial, all are designed to attract deer to a specific place and time, and all enhance the risk of deer-to-deer transmission. So we have tools that can be employed, but when we look at the maps and the prevalence curves, it doesn't seem like we're having all that much success. Well, why is that? So this is a photo of Aldo Leopold. He's known as the father of wildlife management. He was a prolific writer. I suggest if you're interested, pick up a copy of his writings entitled A Sand County Almanac. If you're into wildlife and ethically managing the land, you'll really enjoy it. Leopold identified wildlife management as a 3-legged stool, and you have to have all 3 legs to be successful. Even in 1943, he recognized that people management was the hardest of the 3 legs, and CWD is a prime example of this. Dr. Jordan Pachenik is a retired social scientist from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's a human dimension specialist, and these next few slides are from a talk he gave shortly before he retired and are based on over 15 years of working with stakeholders on CWD in the state of Wisconsin. In Wisconsin and elsewhere, including Pennsylvania, when CWD is initially detected, there's a lot of support for actively addressing CWD. After all, it's the Game Commission's mission to provide healthy wildlife. And landowners do not want CWD. Hunters generally support measures to harvest more deer. But there's a caveat. They have to be convinced that their individual efforts will make a difference. And even if there's strong support initially, it tends to wane over time. Well, why? Turns out there's a host of what Jordan referred to as restraining forces that push back against the will to support active CWD management, and eventually they overwhelm. Things like sharpshooting, bounties for deer, simply not popular. Evidence. Remember how few hunters have actually seen a CWD positive deer in clinical phase? Hunter ethic. Many hunt for sport and tradition, and asking them to be disease managers is very challenging. And even if hunters are willing, they have a consumption limit, and they're unlikely to harvest a lot of extra deer if they cannot use them. Many are not in favor of the type of population reduction that might be necessary to alter outcomes. Doubt. This creeps in over time. There's a lot of alternative theories floating around on the internet and social media that fuel doubt. But what about risk? Many simply believe there's little to no risk of CWD to either deer or humans. So we begin with attitudinal support. Nobody wants CWD, but what we lack is behavioral support. Attitudinal support has failed to translate into sustained behavioral support for actively and aggressively managing CWD in many places over and over again. So what are the issues at hand? Well, keeping CWD from moving farther across your state and North America. Managing the disease where it is today in ways that can alter outcomes. Managing CWD in the commercial captive cervid industry. Identifying those risk factors and pathways for disease movement and managing those factors. Again, misinformation. We live in a society where misinformation can thrive and move very rapidly and influence a lot of stakeholders. And if stakeholders do not support the Game Commission, actively support the Game Commission, the trends you're already documenting are very likely to continue. So I'm going to finish up right back where I started. The data to date, to be honest, don't look very promising, but I do believe it can be turned around. CWD can be managed, but it's not going to be simple. Outcomes can absolutely be altered, but it will not be quick. CWD is management. It's not an a la carte menu. Enacting a small handful of simple measures is very simply not likely to alter disease outcomes. So Commissioner Nick Layton, I think, absolutely nailed it in his quote. The only hope for making things better is for hunters to help wildlife managers. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. And I believe we'll take questions later on after the other speakers. So with that, I will turn it back over to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Excellent as always. We appreciate that national perspective. And now we're going to talk a little bit about Pennsylvania specifically. And here to do that is my colleague, Chief Conservation Officer of the National Deer Association and fellow Pennsylvanian, Kip Adams. All yours, Kip.
All right. Well, thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. And a great job, Dustin and Brian. So appreciate everybody being here tonight. And I would tell you, my part of this is to take the science side of what Brian has shared with us here and really relate this to us as deer hunters. I've been very blessed to be a wildlife biologist for the past 25 plus years. As Nick said, I am a Pennsylvania native, but I will say this, I am first and foremost a deer hunter. I'm interested in understanding certainly how I can continue to be able to hunt healthy populations of deer in the future. And with my job, I'm blessed to be able to take this information and be able to share with other hunters to help them be able to combat this disease as well. So with that, though, let's start by just understanding a little bit about just the importance of deer. And we do know that about 79% of American hunters pursue deer. What this means is that we have about 11 million deer hunters in the United States. I know at times it feels like we have just about all of them in Pennsylvania, but actually Pennsylvania does have a higher density of hunters per square mile than any state in the country. But there's about 11 million deer hunters in total. By comparison, there's only about 3 million turkey hunters, and turkeys are the second most popular hunted species. We have about 1.5 million duck hunters, and we have less than 1 million elk hunters. And I'll tell you this, I love to chase elk, ducks, and turkeys as well, but this really puts into perspective just the sheer number of deer hunters and the magnitude we have of deer hunters relative to other species. And what this means is that deer hunters drive the hunting industry. And this is important because they are the most sought after game species, and deer hunters contribute about 60% of the entire $37 billion that's generated from hunting. In Pennsylvania alone, hunting contributes over $1.5 billion annually to our economy. And this really is important because if we take a look at how we fund many of our wildlife management programs, a lot of this is right off the backs of hunters. As you can see here, deer hunters contribute the lion's share of this. So if you're a deer hunter, this is obviously a big deal, this whole CWD talk. However, even if you're not a deer hunter, if you're a deer enthusiast or a wildlife enthusiast, maybe you like other game species or non-game species, or maybe songbirds are your thing. It doesn't matter which species you prefer, or hopefully you prefer a lot of them. It's important to understand that in many cases, we receive the majority of funding to manage those species and the habitats that they live in from hunting. And deer hunters are the biggest part of this. So having a healthy deer herd is far more important than just the deer hunters out there. It's important to anybody who enjoys wildlife or the wild places that they live. All right, well, from a hunting end, that's CWD is always a big thing. And that's because if we take a look at the species that are susceptible to this disease, hunters chase a lot of them around. We have confirmed the disease in mule deer, elk, black-tailed deer, whitetails, moose, reindeer. These are all things that people love to hunt. And there may be others. It's possible there's other cervids that can be impacted by this that we just haven't identified yet. But even just taking a look at the list that we already have, this is obviously a really big deal to the hunting community. And for the information I just shared with you here a minute ago, this is why all wildlife species out there are affected by this, regardless of if we can hunt them or not. Well, we've heard some great information about this disease. I'm going to share 3 important parts that really hit hard to us hunters. And that is that we know that there is no vaccine for this, there's no cure, and it's 100% fatal to all whitetails. So obviously, as a deer hunter, this is a big deal. We also know that specifically in whitetails, the probability of infection increases with age in both bucks and does, and that adult bucks are more likely to be infected, and in most cases, about twice as likely as adult does. So it's one thing to hear that that's what the science shows, but let's think about what this really means as hunters. What this means is this is why many state wildlife agencies are asking us to decrease the age structure of the buck segment of the population. It's why they're asking us to do the same thing on the doe side, and while they're asking us to reduce deer herds. On paper, by far the best way to combat this disease is to reduce densities and to reduce age structure on both sides. Well, it's in many cases easier said than done. And the reason is we need hunters to implement that plan. So that's one of the reasons that we're doing this tonight, is just making hunters aware of the things that they can do to help battle this disease. The Pennsylvania Game Commission can't do it by themselves. There's no state agency out there that can do it. There's no federal wildlife agency that can help with it. I'm a firm believer in that it will take a better and a stronger working relationship between our state wildlife agencies and our hunters on this issue than anything before. I'm also an optimist. I firmly believe that we can beat this. And that's why I like to be able to share information like this with hunters and just show every hunter what he or she can do to help combat this on a daily basis. And that's what we'll do as we go through here. I'm going to share this picture. This is one of the first 3 wild whitetails that was confirmed with CWD. This is Wisconsin, back in, it was confirmed in 2002, shot during the hunting season of 2001. This was a big deal for this disease. It had been out west for a long time. Most hunters in the east didn't even know about it or had even heard of it. But this is the first time that it was east of the Mississippi River, and that changed the game for everybody. Now, we've heard both Dustin and Brian say deer can have this for 18 to 24 months before they show any signs. However, once they start showing signs, they waste away pretty quickly. However, they almost always die of something else first. So hunters never get to see what one looks like when they do start wasting away. So you will hear hunters say, you know what, I don't see dead deer laying all over. Why is this such a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because they die at a far higher rate before they begin showing signs where we can tell. But I show this picture specifically because take a look at the antlers. It's a nice set of antlers. So what this means is you can look at the deer's body and see it's clearly not healthy. It's wasted right away to almost nothing. However, during the antler growing phase of this year, so roughly from April through August, this deer must have been pretty healthy to be able to grow a very large set of antlers like this. So what this means is this guy shot this during firearm season. However, if he would have got it a couple months sooner, it likely would not have been wasted away like this, and likely would have looked like any other normal deer at that time. So I'm going to show this to hopefully really impress upon us the fact that we can't rely on our eyes in the vast majority of deer to try to assess whether or not this deer has the disease or not. And this one is a perfect example of that. Well, how is CWD introduced into an area? Well, we know for a fact that one of the best ways to move it is movement of an infected captive deer. Captive deer are moved all the time legally, but the problem with this is we don't have a reliable and practical live animal test. And this is not a bash on deer farmers by any means. They don't want to move live deer either. It's not in their best interest to do this. But since we don't have a surefire way to know if a deer has this or not when it's in the early stages, deer are inadvertently moved. This map is from Pennsylvania. This is all of the legal recorded movements between captive facilities over a 10-year period here in the Keystone State. So this is just to show there is a tremendous amount of movements of live animals, in states that have a strong captive deer industry like we do here in Pennsylvania. Ohio, Wisconsin, and there's a bunch of other states that do as well. So what this means is we are moving a lot of deer. This is one of the single best ways that the disease is moved, and it's moved on an all too frequent basis. Actually, we just got the news release today. 2 more captive facilities in the state of Texas confirmed positive for CWD. Those were in Mason and Matagorda counties. Both of those received deer from a Uvalde captive facility that tested positive earlier this year. So now there's 2 new counties in the state of Texas that for the first time have been confirmed CWD positive as a result of moving captive deer. All right, but it's not all captive deer. We know that immigration of an infected wild deer can move it. We know in Pennsylvania and other places that somewhere between 50 and 75% of our yearling bucks are going to disperse from the natal area. They're going to go somewhere between 1 and 5 miles to set up a new home range. And when they do that, if they have the disease, they are taking it with them to these new areas. This is why you hear the Game Commission talk about not wanting to allow these deer to disperse or to be able to harvest some of these deer prior to that dispersal to keep them from moving it to a new area. Another way, and this is something that as hunters we absolutely can help with, one of the easiest ways to move the disease is to move the high-risk parts of a deer that we harvest. High-risk parts are the eyes, the brain, the spleen, the backbone. So what that means is if you harvest a deer that has the disease, take those high-risk parts somewhere else, discard them on the landscape. If another deer comes in contact with those remains, it can contract the disease. So this is exactly why in our disease zones, the Game Commission does not allow you to take these high-risk parts out of the disease zone. This is why a lot of states do not allow you to bring those high-risk parts into those states, regardless of where you came from, whether CWD has been confirmed there or not. So this is a really big issue. And this is one that as hunters, we absolutely need to be aware of. We need to be aware of the risk that's involved if we're moving them. And then as hunters, how we can help by not moving these high-risk parts, by leaving them on site, leaving them on the property where they were, burying them, taking them to a landfill. There's lots of different things we can do with this, but we don't want to be moving them from place to place because we can absolutely help ourselves from that perspective. Well, what are some impacts that CWD has? Obviously, we'll talk about specifically on hunters, but also on society as we go through this. Well, from a hunting end, in almost every case, once the disease arrives, we start talking about things like deer population reduction. We want to take a situation like this, reduce it to something like this. Deer herds are reduced below, in many cases, even what the habitat can support. And this is to keep deer from congregating and sharing this disease among themselves. Now, from a hunting end, this obviously hits us really hard because there's not a hunter on the planet that ever says, man, when I go hunting tomorrow, I hope I see fewer deer than I did today. I mean, that's insane. We're not going to say that. You know, we love to see deer. We want to see deer, whether we're going chasing them with a camera or a bow or a firearm. However, it's in our best interest in these areas that where the disease is found that we do reduce it. The reason for this is very different from the version of this disease that's in cattle. With cattle, if a cow has this prion disease, it can be with 1,000 other head in a pasture and it cannot give it to the others. Man, that is great. And I wish it was like that with deer, but unfortunately it's not. With deer, if one has it, it can very easily transfer to others that it comes into contact with. And research out of Wisconsin shows that if an adult female has the disease, her relatives that live in the nearby area with her are 10 times more likely to also have the disease. So this is why our Game Commission here in particular, and if you're watching this from another state, why most state wildlife agencies are asking the hunters to reduce deer herds, to reduce that amount of mixing that happens with deer, reduce that congregation amount so that deer aren't spreading it to others within those herds and then allowing this disease to continue to increase across the landscape. Well, once you get the disease, it's also the end of deer season as you know it. And you know what? I grew up in a very traditional hunting camp in northern Pennsylvania. I'm very blessed. I still get to hunt out of that camp. And I know how traditional we can be as hunters. We want deer season to start on the same day. We want to have the same people in camp. We want to go sit in the same spot because we've had great memories with that. Unfortunately, once CWD arrives, all of that goes out the window. And for good reason. Once it's there, now we have CWD check stations. We have to provide samples, which means in many cases you're taking home headless deer. And is this an inconvenience? It absolutely is an inconvenience. But you know what? If you care about deer and you care about deer hunting, it's an inconvenience worth dealing with. This is the way that allows our Game Commission to understand rate of spread of the disease, prevalence rate within that deer herd, And based on low or high prevalence rates and how much it's spread, they can attack it in different ways. So this is the information that they need to be able to do the best job they can at keeping this disease from spreading. From a hunting end, if you're hunting in a disease zone, the only way to know if that deer has a disease or not is to have it tested. And I'll talk more about this later relative to eating that, but this is absolutely in our best interest to have these tested to help us and help the Game Commission. Well, once it arrives, we also end up with things like movement regulations. We're going to be taking those high-risk parts out of the disease zone, longer hunting seasons, additional hunting seasons, sharpshooting. These are all things that really, throw us off relative to our culture, and what we have for tradition. But these are all things that do help battle this disease. Brian Richards talked to you a little bit about some of the things we're doing already that likely aren't anywhere near intensive enough yet. So these are the type of things that, yes, while they do inconvenience us, they're ones that as hunters, we should absolutely appreciate the Game Commission for doing this for us and then do our part to help do everything possible to keep it from spreading. Once the disease arrives, there's always a loss of privileges. There's no more baiting, no more feeding, no using minerals, no urine attractants. The reason being, all of these are things that congregate deer, and that's what we absolutely want to stop. We don't want them intermingling any more than they possibly have to. We don't want them swapping spit at these mineral licks or at these feed sites or at these bait sites. So that's why this is not allowed anymore. If you like to do formal camera surveys in the summertime to estimate numbers of deer and age structures of deer and all that, that all goes out the window. If you like to use minerals and other things to survey deer during the rest of the year outside of the hunting season where this is legal, all that stuff goes out the window. I'm a huge trail camera fan. I've been using trail cameras since the 90s when I was in graduate school. And it's very clear that if you use minerals or salt, it's really easy to be able to get deer in front of a camera to take pictures of them. However, a colleague of mine from the state of Missouri, deer biologist there, has a great photo. Well, I guess depending on how you want to look at a great photo. Here goes. He has a photo of a deer that tested positive for CWD standing in a mineral lick. Water is in the lick. This deer is there obviously to consume the minerals in some of that water. Drooping ears. It is drooling into the lick. We know that saliva is one of the ways that these prions are spread, that other deer can contract the disease. And if that's not bad enough, in the pictures at night, behind the deer are additional sets of deer eyes for two other deer waiting their turn to get into that lick to get a little drink of that water and to get some minerals. Right after the CWD positive deer is dropping the saliva in there. So you may disagree with the Game Commission and think, gosh, I really want to be able to do this, but this is why this is not allowed anymore once the disease is confirmed in an area. Well, once it's there, mature bucks are no longer encouraged. Science says the best way to battle this is to drive this age structure young. So that's why in some states you see removal of antler point restrictions. It's not a cut and dry issue in many places, though. We know for sure if we could have hunters agree to shoot more bucks and does, that we would do a better job battling this disease. But the reality of it is many hunters are just reluctant to do that. I'd be surprised to know that less than half of the hunters in the United States will shoot a single deer this deer season. The average is only 41%. So think about that. Only 4 out of 10 hunters are going to kill a single deer this year. Only 18% will kill more than one. So think about that. All of the bag limits that we have. Georgia's a perfect example. Buy your deer license in Georgia, you get an opportunity to shoot 8 antlerless deer and 2 bucks. So every deer hunter can kill 10 deer. Yet less than half of the hunters are going to kill one. And you know what? We're good at a lot of things in Pennsylvania, but actually our success rates are even lower than the national average. Only about 37% of Pennsylvania hunters shoot a single deer a year, and only 13 or 14% shoot more than one. So what this means is we could really help ourselves by upping our game as hunters and shooting in an additional deer this year. Now, I agree that part of this is people say, I just can't eat that much, so I'm not going to shoot another deer. But you know what? We can really help ourselves and be heroes in this, because today in the United States, 1 out of every 7 households is food insecure. Think about that. 1 out of 7 households today don't have enough protein in there. So think about this from a hunting end or a situation where there's additional deer in the landscape that we could shoot. And if we did, that would help the deer herd. And if we did that, that would help us secure the future of hunting for us. Oh, and at the same time, we could feed families who need food. Oh, man, that is a win-win-win situation for us. That is a great public image outcry for us. And actually in the United States, only 4% of us buy a hunting license. And you'll hear some people say, it's my God-given right to hunt, and I'll always be able to do that. And you know what? I wish that was true, but that's not true. We don't get to do anything because 4% of us want to do it. We get to hunt today because nearly 80% of the public supports legal, ethical, regulated hunting. And the reason that support is so high is because food is looked at as one of the main reasons for hunting. And I'm going to touch more on that here in a little bit, but this is a great way for us to be able to go out, shoot an additional deer this year, help the deer herd, help us as hunters, and help families. So great opportunity that we have. All right. Once the disease arrives, we also know that license money gets diverted from herd and habitat management to monitoring CWD. You have to sample for it. You have to monitor for it. You have to find where it is. These are all things that are very necessary, but it's expensive. It is really, really expensive. The Wisconsin DNR to date has spent over $50 million on this. But you know what? It's something that they have to do. Thank God that they're doing this so that we can learn more about it and keep other states from having it increase to the rate that it has in Wisconsin. But just think about this. The DNR doesn't want to spend all this on that. And think if they didn't have CWD and they could have, instead of spending this $50 million on that, they could have spent it on things like hunter access programs, land purchases, habitat enhancement. Man, that would be such a nice use of this money. Now, I'm showing you this not to take anything away from the Wisconsin DNR, but just to impress upon you even more. If this is not in your area, we need to do everything possible to keep it from getting there so we don't run into the same boat. We also know that hunting participation rates can decline. I'm going to use Wisconsin again. This is the paid license holders the last year in Wisconsin before they confirmed the disease. First year after it, paid license holders dropped a bunch. Well, the next year it rebounded a little bit, but you know what? After 10 years, it never did recover. And some will say, well, if there's fewer hunters, that's a good thing. I don't want to be crowded in the woods anyway. And I don't like to be crowded either, but I'll say this. That's kind of a short-sighted opinion of this, because fewer hunters leads to less money for wildlife, and fewer hunters leads to less advocates for hunting. We talked earlier on how the majority of our wildlife management programs are funded through hunting, our license sales, the excise taxes on the gear that hunters buy. So fewer hunters means we don't have as much to manage wildlife with. And fewer hunters leads to less advocates, and that's not a good thing either. I just told you that only 4% of the U.S. population or U.S. adults purchases a hunting license. It's that 80% that support us that allows us to continue to hunt, and we need to do everything possible to make sure that we maintain that high support rate. Cool thing is, we're at an all-time high for hunter support ratings right now, and that's a good thing. Think about this. If we can feed families that need food and show hunters as the saviors here, that can increase that approval rating even higher, make hunters have an even higher public image. That is a really, really good thing, and something that's very obtainable for us. We know there's economic repercussions in an area once CWD arrives, and that is because, as of right now, there is no way to decontaminate a CWD positive site. Brian shared with you, once those materials are in the ground, they stay there for years, in some cases decades, and can still infect deer that come in contact with that years and years later. So since there is no way to decontaminate a site, land value declines. In Missouri, when they first identified or first confirmed the disease, there was a loss of $200 to $400 per acre. That's a big deal. So nobody wants to see their land be worth less than it was in the past, but CWD is a surefire way to make that happen. Also know that no state has won the CWD battle. CWD prions remain in the soil. They're going to be there. The disease continues to spread through deer herds. So there's a lot of states out there that are doing everything possible to limit the spread. We certainly want to do that in Pennsylvania. And it'd be great that someday we can actually say, hey, somebody actually has won the CWD battle. But with what we know right now, this is not available, and nobody has done this yet. I'm going to share a couple graphs here, similar ones to what Brian showed you, just to impress upon you the importance of us taking action in Pennsylvania right now. I'll show you three different counties from Wisconsin. This first here, you see in the red oblong here is South Central Iowa County. This shows the infection rate or the prevalence rate in adult bucks, which are those 2.5 and older, yearling bucks, adult males, and yearling females. Let's just look at the solid blue line, just the adult bucks. So those that are 2 and older. Back in 2002, only about 1% of all the adult bucks in this Iowa County, South Central Iowa County had the disease. But look what happened by 2014. Look what has happened with this there. Today, over 30% of those bucks have it. And this growth curve doesn't show any signs of slowing down, does it? Let's look at southeastern Richland County. 35% of their adult bucks had the disease. And this went from, same thing, 0 or 1% in the early 2000s. North Central Iowa County is even worse, over 45% of their bucks. And what the thing is, you can take a look at exactly where we are in Pennsylvania right now, and we are in the early stages of these growth curves, but it's looking exactly like what we see here. And I share these with you to impress upon you that, one, if we don't do anything in Pennsylvania, this is exactly what we're going to have in a matter of a few years. This is how important it is in the urgency that we have right now to take drastic action to make sure that we don't have graphs that looks just like Wisconsin a decade from now. So what does this mean for deer management then? Well, fewer mature bucks? Absolutely. That's what that means. Lower deer densities? Yep, absolutely. And fewer disease-free deer? That means all three of those is what we have in our future unless we take some serious action. So, which brings us to the point from a safety end. Is CWD positive venison safe to eat? Well, according to both the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control, there currently is no evidence that humans can contract Creutzfeldt-Jakob, that's the human version of this prion disease, from eating CWD infected deer. But you know what? Both organizations strongly encourage people to get their deer tested and to not eat venison that is CWD positive. So the only way to know if it is or not is to have that deer tested. That's why we strongly encourage you to do this. This is why the Pennsylvania Game Commission strongly encourages to do this. But we know that there's going to be some people out there that say, you know what, I've probably eaten CWD positive venison in the past. I'm going to do it again. And if somebody wants to do that, it's certainly your prerogative. You have that choice. However, if you're going to do that, are you still going to take a chance and maybe feed that to your little boy or your little girl or your niece or nephew? Or how about that family down the street that could use a little extra food, that you give them a few steaks or some hamburger, or maybe you give them a whole deer? So I certainly would hope that you wouldn't do this. We have a great outlet for this extra venison by giving it to needy families, church groups, soup kitchens, etc. But it's not just about you not wanting to get a deer tested. By testing our deer, we can help the Game Commission do a better job minimizing spread, and we can certainly ensure that it's safe for us to eat and safe for us to be able to give away. So I seriously hope that you will consider that this deer season, if you hunt in a disease zone, get that deer tested and wait till you get a satisfactory result from that test before you go ahead and eat. All right. Well, we've heard a little bit now about the science. We've heard kind of what this means specifically to us as hunters. Let's talk about Pennsylvania here specifically, and what we're really trying to safeguard. A lot of people like to take shots at the Game Commission, and of course, everybody loves to hate their state wildlife agency. But let's just take a look at how Pennsylvania deer hunting compares to much of the country. At the National Deer Association, we can compile an annual report. It's our deer report. It's available on our website at deerassociation.com. It's a free download. You can go and take a look. We compile all kinds of state-by-state harvest estimates, numbers of bucks, shot, doe shot, age structure of those, and all kinds of other stuff. If you're a deer nut, you would love to take a look at this report. So we always compile a top 5 list. So antler buck harvest, top 5 states in the country that for shooting antler bucks. Texas is almost always number 1, but they're a huge state, right? They're big, a lot of deer hunters. However, Pennsylvania, we are always on this top 5 list. And I'm sharing with you the 2019 harvest because that was when we published this in January of this year. Most of the 2020 deer seasons were still going on. So the 2019 harvest was the most recent season that we had data available from all states across the United States. So anyway, Pennsylvania, we're in the top 5 list for numbers of bucks. But this isn't really an apples to apples comparison. So we also take a look at this buck harvest on a per square mile basis. All right, this is a lot more apples to apples. This lets the smaller states really get in the game. So how do you think we compare in Pennsylvania hunting or harvesting bucks relative to other states? Well, actually, we do even better than I just showed you. We're number 2 on this list. Michigan is the only state in the country that shoots more bucks than we do, and that's just by a fraction. Pennsylvania deer hunters are really good at shooting bucks. All right, well, how about the antlerless side? Because this is really where the rubber meets the road. You can't have a successful deer management program if you don't harvest the appropriate number of antlerless deer each year. At the NDA, we're obviously proponents of the quality deer management philosophy. Many people think, that begins with the bucks, and that's not true. QDM is first and foremost about having the right number of deer on the landscape, and you achieve that by having an appropriate antlerless harvest. Well, top 5 list here. Texas is number 1 again. We're number 2. And if you take a look at on a per square mile basis here, we do even better. Look at this. And I want you to take a look at the top 4 states: Delaware, PA, Maryland, and New Jersey. Think about where these are on a map. We are all in the mid-Atlantic region. This is the sweet spot relative to deer management across much of the country. We have very productive habitat. We have big, high-density deer herds and a lot of deer in the landscape, which from a hunting end is a lot of fun, right? We like to see deer. It also gives us lots of opportunity to shoot deer, which is a whole lot of fun. However, some responsibility comes with that as well. And responsibility to shoot an appropriate number of deer on any given year to keep them in balance with that habitat, that responsibility is even up once this disease arrives. And now that CWD is spreading throughout the state, we need to shoot even more deer. We need to shoot even more bucks. We need to shoot even more does to move ourselves even up higher on this harvest per square mile list, but to safeguard our deer herd so that we can ensure that us, our kids, our grandkids, 10, 20, 50, 100 years down the road, have a very healthy deer to be able to go out and hunt. The cool thing is we have the deer herd available to do this, and we can only help ourselves by shooting additional deer this year. So everybody listening to this tonight, I certainly hope that you will consider that, take an extra deer in areas where you're able to do that. And if you can't eat it all, give it to somebody else and help them out as well. All right. So I'll end with by saying, you know what? Pennsylvania rocks from a deer harvest end. We are one of only 3 states to shoot 300,000 deer annually. Last deer season I showed you, we harvested over 3.5 antlered bucks per square mile. That is a really, really high buck harvest. Michigan was the only state that shot more. For the 11th year in a row, over half of our antlered buck harvest was at least 2.5 years old. Actually, in fact, it was the highest percentage of it's ever recorded. In most cases, this is reason to celebrate big time. And if you're not in a disease zone, it's still reason to celebrate. However, if you are in a disease zone, this starts to become problematic. We've talked earlier about how older bucks are about twice as likely as those older does to have it. So if you do have the disease, this is why we don't want to see those age structures get really old. We want to see those be driven a little bit younger. And we harvested over 5 antlerless deer per square mile. Delaware was the only state that shot more, but look at this last bullet. If you combine our buck and our antlerless harvest, there's not a single state in the country that shoots more deer per square mile than we do. That's pretty cool. We're awfully good at shooting deer. And as I just said, we have the ability to do more. And I hope that that you will follow my lead here and actually do more this coming year to help ourselves. So current status then, there's a lot of concern about the increased spread of CWD, both new states as well as new areas within states. Brian talked earlier about the county in Southern Virginia now, 160 miles from the nearest positive that they just confirmed. So this just isn't a little bit of a spread. This is a huge spread into a new area. There's those 2 counties that I told you about in Texas tonight. But there's also much concern about the future of wildlife, our deer herds, deer hunting, and all wildlife management, given the importance that deer hunting and the dollars that come in have on all of our other wildlife species. So is CWD the end of deer hunting? I'm going to say no, it's not. But we absolutely have to be vigilant to minimize transmission in existing areas where we already have the disease and prevent introduction of CWD into new areas. And ultimately, we need to support research to learn more about this, and we need to support the Game Commission's efforts with this disease. We have this document that you're welcome to go to our website and grab. This is our recommended practices for deer hunters who live in these or hunt in these disease zones. Talks about harvesting information, talks about habitat information, and other stuff. So I welcome you to be able to go and grab this. With that, this is my email address. Feel free to email me anytime if I can answer questions or help. We're going to do a Q&A once we're all done here tonight. But after this meeting, if I can do something, by all means, please reach out. And now that we kind of understand what this really means from the hunter side and just what or how good our deer hunting is in Pennsylvania and then what the Game Commission is trying to safeguard, I'll turn it back over to Nick here to let Andrea come up and show you exactly what the Game Commission is doing to protect this precious resource.
All right, Kip, thank you very much. And as Kip said, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to the Pennsylvania Game Commission and Andrea Corman. Okay, Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, you got that?
Looks great.
Okay. All right, so good evening, everybody. So to start us off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of CWD in Pennsylvania. So CWD surveillance in Pennsylvania has been ongoing since 1998. And as of today, over 107,000 deer and nearly 1,600 elk have been tested. In 2003, the first Pennsylvania interagency CWD response plan was developed by agencies like the Game Commission, Pennsylvania Department of Ag, USDA, and there were also many others. This was also the beginning of our statewide sampling, where previously only clinical suspects were tested for CWD. Then in 2006, authority over the captive cervid industry was transferred from the Game Commission to Pennsylvania Department of Ag. So in Pennsylvania, CWD is actually managed under two different agencies, which can be challenging. In 2012, we had our first detections of CWD in Pennsylvania. And then in July of last year, our agency response plan was approved by the Board of Commissioners, and we began implementing it that fall. So going back to our first detections, in October 2012, CWD was detected in a captive facility, which is represented on this map by a yellow star that was in Adams County. And this resulted in the creation of Disease Management Area, or DMA 1. And that facility was depopulated. And then 2 months later, 3 hunter harvested free ranging deer, which are represented by the red dots on the map, tested positive in Blair and Bedford counties, which resulted in the establishment of DMA 2. Now, given the distance, these events are not necessarily related, so it's hard to say exactly how CWD got into Pennsylvania. Now, DMA 3 was created in 2014 after CWD was detected in 2 captive facilities in Jefferson County. Then DMA 1 was actually dissolved in 2017 after going 5 consecutive years without any additional CWD detections. Then in 2018, DMA 4 was created after CWD was detected in a captive cervid facility in Lancaster County. Now within DMAs, there is a ban on removing high-risk parts, feeding deer, and using urine-based attractants. And even with these restrictions in place and increased surveillance, DMAs have continued to expand and more deer test positive each year. So if the trajectory of the disease increases in Pennsylvania like it has in other states, the infection rate in portions of Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties will likely exceed 30% in the next 10 to 20 years and will continue to spread throughout the state. The revised and updated response plan establishes a framework for managing CWD in Pennsylvania. Now, currently, the best management strategy to control CWD is to reduce deer abundance in infected areas to slow the rate of disease transmission and remove infected individuals from the landscape. Many of the strategies in the plan focus on ways to limit the spread of the disease and prevent it from becoming established in new areas. So the response plan identifies 4 different types of management areas. So we've got the disease management areas, or the DMAs, the established area, enhanced surveillance units, and containment zones. And each of those is associated with different objectives and strategies. So these are current DMAs, and a DMA is created when new CWD detections are found in either free-ranging or captive deer, regardless of proximity to any previous detections. A 10-mile buffer is then placed around each detection. And 10 miles is used because this encompasses the dispersal distances of most deer in Pennsylvania, and it includes the area where that positive deer may have been spreading prions. Now, depending on the location of the detection, it might have no effect. It could result in the expansion of an existing DMA, or it could actually cause a whole new DMA to be created. So the purpose of a DMA is to reduce the human-assisted spread of CWD. Sampling is increased to detect CWD spread from known locations, and feeding deer is prohibited, along with the use of natural urine-based attractants. Both of those can cause increased congregation of deer and can therefore increase transmission of the disease. High-risk parts cannot be taken outside of the DMA, and I'll define high-risk parts more later, but generally we're talking about the brain and the spinal column. We also increased antlerless allocations in the wildlife management units that have had CWD detections to reduce deer abundance and help limit spread of the disease. And head collection bins are also provided for hunters to submit deer heads for testing to increase our sampling and surveillance. So next we have the established area. We currently only have one, and it is within DMA 2. Now, an established area is characterized by CWD detections that occur contiguously across a large area and consistently from year to year. In an established area, CWD is considered established within the deer population, and coupled with environmental contamination poses a long-term threat to neighboring areas. So this area covers primarily Blair, Bedford, and Fulton counties, or in terms of wildlife management units, we're looking at 4A and a small portion of 2C. But over 90% of our positives have come from this area. So in an established area, the extent of CWD infection is more significant than in other areas. So the goal is to maintain sample prevalence at or below 5% and minimize the movement of high-risk parts to other areas. So that 5% was chosen because data from other states and models show once that threshold is crossed, disease prevalence accelerates drastically, making management of the disease even more difficult. To reach that goal, reducing deer abundance is our primary management strategy for this area. So this is done through increased hunter harvest and helps reduce the potential for disease transmission and also removes additional positive deer from the landscape. Now, due to the degree of the infection in this area, transport of high-risk parts outside of the established area is prohibited, and that's a new regulation for this year. Other DMA restrictions also apply here, so there's no feeding deer or using the natural urine-based attractants in the established area either. So I mentioned the goal of 5% or less for sample prevalence in the established area. Based on hunter harvested adult deer, our sample prevalence in the established area has been above 5% since the 2018 season and is now actually close to about 14%. So it's clear that there is a significant problem in the established area. Next, we have our enhanced surveillance units. So these are individual areas within DMAs that are created when there's a new CWD detection, again, in either a free-ranging or captive deer, that is greater than 5 miles from any other past detection. So these units are created by using an approximately 3 to 5 mile radius buffer around this isolated detection. Now that buffer was chosen to balance the need to focus surveillance efforts in the area where a CWD infected deer was likely to have traveled and still be able to collect enough samples to meet the target sample size. So in these new areas, the extent and sample prevalence of CWD are unknown. And each enhanced surveillance unit has an associated DMAP unit. So to the public, this will look and function just like any other DMAP unit. And these little units highlighted in pink on the map are the 8 that we created last year. So the purpose of an enhanced surveillance unit is to determine the extent and sample prevalence of CWD through increased sampling. And this is primarily achieved through increased hunter harvest. And the target sample size for each unit is approximately 250 to 300 deer to give us an adequate confidence that we would detect the disease if it's in a small percentage of the population that's within that unit. And hunters can purchase up to 2 additional antlerless tags per unit to help us meet those sample goals. So last year, hunter participation was relatively good, with all but 1 unit selling at least 50% or more of available permits. We also exceeded our target sample size in 4 of those units. And in the units where we did not reach the 250 samples, we still received really good numbers, and the samples from those units are still informative. And last but not least, we have our containment zones. So these are the smallest geographic areas consisting of an approximately 1 mile radius buffer around the location of a new CWD detection. And this size is based on a deer's average home range. So that includes the individuals it was most likely to come in contact with and potentially infect. And this area represents our best option to suppress the impact of an initial CWD detection. And this is just an example map with a hypothetical enhanced surveillance unit and containment zone, just so you can see exactly how small a containment zone really is. So the purpose of a containment zone is to prevent the establishment and spread of CWD by removing the most high-risk deer from the area immediately surrounding a detection. And management strategies in these areas can include increased hunter harvest and targeted removal to ensure that the deer most likely to have come in contact with that positive detection are removed. And given the small scale of these areas, communication and outreach to landowners for hunting access also occurs as a regular part of this process. And targeted removals do not occur unless we have permission from the landowner. So moving on to some of our other management strategies, we already know it's unlawful to remove or export high-risk parts from a DMA or the established area. It is also unlawful to import these parts from any state or province outside Pennsylvania. That's also a new regulation this year. So high-risk parts include the head, more specifically the brain, eyes, lymph nodes, and tonsils, along with the spinal cord and spleen. And these parts are considered high risk because prions concentrate in high densities in these locations. The importance of these regulations is to prevent people from dumping high-risk parts on the landscape in uninfected areas, possibly contaminating the soil in that area, or even exposing healthy deer or elk to the disease. Now, I've mentioned reducing deer numbers to slow the rate of disease transmission and to remove diseased individuals from the landscape. So how exactly do we go about doing that? The best way is to increase hunter harvest, and then in very specific situations, use targeted removal. We can and have increased hunter harvest in several ways. So we can increase antlerless harvest at the wildlife management unit scale through antlerless license allocations, or at a smaller scale using DMAP permits in the enhanced surveillance units. Concurrent firearm seasons also give hunters more flexibility to use those opportunities. And successful management of CWD can't occur without hunters. Their cooperation is essential, and removing barriers to participation, like limited time to hunt, is one way that we can do this. And targeted removals are an option in certain areas with specific objectives, like I mentioned. And again, these are very small scale operations that are carried out by wildlife professionals from USDA Wildlife Services, and they only occur post-hunting season. And these efforts, again, are heavily dependent on landowner participation, as removals only occur on those properties where access has been permitted. Our surveillance efforts are also critical in detecting new cases of CWD and tracking the spread and sample prevalence of the disease. So in addition to testing white-tailed deer, we do test elk as well, and nearly all hunter harvested elk are tested along with roadkill and clinical suspect elk. So far, no elk has tested positive and no deer from within the elk management area have tested positive, but we have had over 700 CWD detections since it was initially detected in 2012. Now for deer, we collect samples through a variety of methods. That includes hunter harvest from voluntary samples from the head collection bins, which are only located within DMAs, as well as hunter harvest samples collected from meat processors statewide. Contractors are also employed to collect roadkill deer from state and local roads within and around the perimeter of DMAs. And those are probably our most important samples. They are often the first indication that the disease is expanding into new areas. And clinical suspects are also collected statewide. So to help the public stay current with our sampling efforts, we actually have a new dashboard that you can access from our main CWD page under CWD test results and surveillance data. So it lets you see our most up-to-date sampling data and consists of 3 different pages. So there's samples over time, sample prevalence, and sample statistics. And the sample prevalence page you see here contains a series of filters and maps to provide information at different scales. And we're actually working with Department of Ag to develop one showing information for the captive industry. And that should be available to the public relatively soon. And as part of the Game Commission's efforts to effectively manage CWD and other wildlife diseases, the Wildlife Futures Program was started in 2019. And Wildlife Futures is a partnership between the Game Commission and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Veterinary Medicine. And this program combines wildlife disease expertise and research from Penn Vet with the Game Commission's commitment to protecting, managing, and promoting wildlife in Pennsylvania. Wildlife Futures has a CWD diagnostic lab that provides 2 different types of testing, including a more rapid test that has helped us improve turnaround time. So in other words, we can notify a hunter of their deer's test results within days rather than weeks. And some of the CWD research they're doing includes work to develop a rapid field test for CWD using biomarkers from infected deer, and also development of procedures where dogs are actually trained to detect CWD in deer feces. So for more information on their research and other services, you can visit the Wildlife Futures website at this link. And we actually also have this phone number and email available for the public to use for any CWD related questions. So that's all I have. Thank you all very much. And Nick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Appreciate that. Great work out of the Game Commission, as everybody's heard here. Reminder, get your questions and answers in. I did put that in the chat if you didn't see it. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. I see there is one in the chat, and we'll get to that one. So let's go ahead and bring all of our panelists back up here on the screen and start going through these questions. And so the first one is, European mounts are becoming quite popular and skull cleaning is how I make my living. And so that's not really a question as much as a comment. And so, Andrea, is it still legal to have European mounts?
Oh yeah. Yeah, you just can't take the high risk parts out of the DMA.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Are there any caveats the Game Commission is looking at that would open up the state to approved taxidermists? It feels as if my service territory is shrinking every year in the Southeast. Thanks for keeping us informed and appreciate putting together these videos. Thanks.
So in terms of taxidermists and even processors, we do have the regulations that those high-risk parts cannot leave the disease management area. We do have the option for businesses that are within 5 miles of the DMA can sign up as a cooperating processor, and they basically sign a contract with us that they agree to dispose of those high-risk parts properly, allow us to come and sample at their facility, a number of things in that contract, but it is only up to 5 miles outside the DMA. If you're a facility within the DMA, you can still essentially accept deer from anywhere except other DMAs. They still can't leave whatever DMA they were taken from, but at least if you're in the DMA, you can still do a good amount of business.
Okay, this is along the same lines. So sorry.
Hang on, Nick,
Oh.
John Morgan, you stopped my video, I think. That's why my dogs are showing there. So if somebody can I can't turn my video back on, but anyway, I wanted to add to that. Okay. In the Southeast region, and I'm sure it's this way in the other regions as well, we host a meeting before hunting season, probably late August, early September, for new folks, new processors, new taxidermists that are interested in getting signed up and getting their word out there. So if there is anybody interested, again, in the Southeast region, contact the region office and we'll get you on a list and we'll get you invited to one of our meetings that we have just prior to the season and give you all the lowdown on how to get involved with that program.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Related, can approved CWD deer processors move high-risk parts to CWD approved taxidermists in a different DMA? Are taxidermist collection sites at deer processors in different DMAs an allowable solution, with transport only taking place by an approved CWD deer processor or taxidermist with proper disposal? This would eliminate risk of improper handling, but give taxidermists more options. Did you follow that? That was complicated.
It's a long one. I have it pulled up so I can read it. So at this time, no, that's not allowed. If you harvest a deer in a DMA, it stays in that DMA. If our DMAs continue to get bigger, and if at some point, DMA 2 and 3 look like they may end up touching, that might be something that we discuss in the future, but as of this point right now, that's not something that we can do.
Does the PGC view leaving high-risk deer parts in the field as a better solution than a lined landfill or other approved disposal methods? And so this is broader than a PGC issue. This is something that gets talked about nationally. And so, Andrea, I'll give you a break and throw it over to Brian Richards.
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting question. What's a better thing to do? Really, the best thing to do is to make sure that, that carcass parts, especially, spinal cord, brain material from potentially CWD positive animals, don't move geographically and then find their way out into, the back 40. So the instance of, a hunter going to Colorado or the core area in Pennsylvania or in Wisconsin who doesn't live there, harvesting an animal, taking it home, butchering that animal themselves, and then, not having a good alternative to dispose of the carcass waste, just dump it out on the landscape. That's the worst case scenario. So as far as, I think we almost get into kind of splitting hairs when we're talking about should you do a boneless processing in the field of an individual deer as opposed to assuring that the carcass parts end up in a lined landfill. I think, like I said, I think we're getting into nuance that's very, very challenging to really give you a best case scenario. Worst case scenario is moving it someplace new. Best case scenario is, making sure it's not anyplace else.
Great, thanks, Brian. And this one was in the chat. How long does it take to get CWD test results?
So it varies depending on the part of the season. It's a little bit longer of a turnaround time during rifle because that's when most of our deer are harvested. But I believe this last season, we averaged about 9 days from the time we entered it into the system until the time we got the results. So you figure you add on a couple of days that the hunter submitted the sample and we pick it up and sample it. And also, maybe a day by the time we get the results and can notify the hunter or send out a letter. But at least from, entering in the database to the time we get the results was 9 days.
Okay. And so at this point, it looks like we're out of questions. So again, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out to attend this evening. I hope you found all this information very useful. And if you have additional questions about chronic wasting disease, there are a lot of resources out there. The Pennsylvania Game Commission website's a good place. You can also check out the dashboard there that shows you where CWD is in the state. You can also check out the CWD Resource Center on the National Deer Association website. So a little plug for us there. You can find that pretty easily there. And finally, these are recorded. So if you know someone that probably should have seen this or would have liked to have seen it, but maybe they missed it, you can look for that on the YouTube channel of the National Deer Association. I think we're turning these around pretty quickly within a day or so you can find it there. And with that, have a great evening, everybody. Thank you again for joining us. Take care.
See you guys.